shine your light on us today. There's a lot going on in the world, so I just pray that Jesus shines his light. I don't know about y'all, but I sure wanted to shine on me. I want to shine on y'all today. Good morning, Essential. Good morning. I'm going to let you know a little secret before I begin. All pastors are nervous when they stand in front of the people of God. I don't care what they say to you, all of them are nervous, right? Because this is important. And someone told me one day, they said, you know, it's okay to be nervous and anxious. Because that means it's important to you. That means you're not taking things lightly. It's okay to have butterflies. This is for anybody, students, older people, whenever you're doing something that's important, it's okay to have butterflies. Someone said the prayer is that the butterflies fly in formation. So they carry you where God would have you to go, and you're not flitting all around the world with the crazy butterflies, right? So I just want to call that out there. Sometimes people think they're not supposed to be nervous. We're nervous. I'm grateful to be before you. I know you didn't expect to see me today, but I'm honored and grateful each time Reverend Ross trusts me to stand in this space. I want to start by thanking my Central family for your love and your support and your kindness and the cards and the prayers as we process the passing of my Aunt Eva Roberson. My Aunt Eva was my mother's last living sibling. That means that she was the last of a generation for our family. And our family is grateful for the lessons that she and her siblings, which included my mother who passed in 1994, shared with us, and lessons that their parents shared with them and passed on to us. And so we grieve her absence in this realm, but we rejoice that her soul is with the Lord. We rejoice. So I want to take a moment to thank you all for your love and your kindness. Before I start, I wanted to read the New Revised Standard Version of Romans 12, 1 through 2. Thank you so much, Reverend Davis, for reading the NIV version. We're going to hear several versions of this short passage as we move forward this morning. I think it's really important to hear verses in different ways. You receive something different when the words are a little different. So the New Revised Standard Version says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercy of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual, or some versions say reasonable, worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Won't you pray with me? God of mercy, I come before you praying that I may decrease and that you may increase, and that the butterflies will fly in formation, that you speak through me and your word will fall on open hearts and open minds and open ears. May the word of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts together be acceptable in your sight, Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen? Amen. Amen. As I said, you're going to hear that scripture in a few ways, what it means to worship with your whole life. I know it's Transfiguration Sunday, but that was too big of an order, so Pastor said, just do Romans. I said, okay. Under the circumstances, it would be really easy to talk about corporate worship. We're in the church. We're doing corporate worship right now. But I think sometimes we get so focused and caught up on corporate worship, church, that we forget that we are called to individual worship. And we forget to examine what that looks like. Yes, that's prayer and that's scripture reading and studying the Bible and meditation. But what does it mean to do as Paul suggests, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual, your reasonable, the least you really need to do, reasonable worship. Worship. It's one of the 6 marks of discipleship that we commit to living into here at Central, yes? Yes. Worship. I talked to some people about what that meant because, you know, people have different ideas about what it means to worship. And some of the words, some people just gave me words. Some of the words I got was adoration, worship, devotion, giving honor and reverence to God. Someone went a little beyond that and said, it's the outward expression of one's admiration, love, and devotion of a being. Who do you worship? Another friend of mine defined worship as literally bowing before God. And as I was preparing today, I was listening to Paul Morton's Bow Down and Worship. Yeah. That song just did something to me early in the morning. The Voice version, there's a version of the Bible called The Voice. It's not the TV show. It's the actual version of the Bible called The Voice. And that version of the Bible says, brothers and sisters, in light of all I have shared with you about God's mercy, I urge you to offer your bodies as living and holy sacrifice to God, a sacred offering that brings him pleasure. This is your reasonable, essential worship. See the differences? Yeah. The editor of that Bible put a little note that said, Paul urges those who read and hear this letter to respond to the good news by offering their bodies, our eyes, our ears, our mouths, our hands, our feet to God as a living sacrifice. Such an odd phrase. Paul knows well enough that sacrifice ends in death, not life. Think about it. When we talk about the Old Testament, sacrifice was killing and offering that killing to God. So why would Paul say that? He recognized that the sacrifice of Jesus changes everything. His resurrection steals life from death and makes it possible for those who trust in him to become a sacrifice, and yet we live. Right. We can offer our whole life as a living sacrifice. But how do we live? How do we worship with our whole lives? I mentioned the passing of my aunt, that there was a whole generation that is now gone. My mother had 4 siblings. My grandparents had 5 children. My mother was the baby. There were 4 girls and 1 boy. And all of the women in my family were fierce. Hair laid, done, all the time. I remember one time I thought I was going to get locks with my aunt. Said, are you ever going to comb your hair, baby? Because that's not what we do in this family. So they were always laid fashion forward. They made their own clothes if they needed to. They were not going to look like everyone else, but they were going to be sharp at all times. My grandparents were from North Carolina, Palmer, North Carolina, a little town, but they were entrepreneurs. My grandfather was able to build their home. And unfortunately, when my mother was 2 weeks old, my grandfather passed. So my grandmother had to figure out what to do. She became an entrepreneur. She turned the rooms in the house after my older aunts and uncle moved out and started a boarding home for the teachers that came to the town. My mother did not like all the teachers living in the house with her. She had land across the street that she turned into a baseball field and had fish fries and rented it out. And she also happened to have the town store. And behind the house, I was told, was the juke joint. She was a bootleg lady. Selling moonshine. Entrepreneurial. Yes. And so my family migrated with my mother. My aunts and uncles had moved north, and when my mother was 9, my grandmother moved to New York as well to be with her children. And the entrepreneurial spirit traveled with them. How many of you know that doing hair at your kitchen table and using the stove to heat up the Marcel iron is entrepreneurial? My Aunt Eva did hair in the kitchen and people look sharp, yes? Yes. So they were all really sharp and fierce women in my family. They took care of their family, they did what they needed to do, but there was something really special about my aunt. She was my favorite. And I'm not supposed to say that, but the truth is the truth. And maybe it's because all of my other aunts were really tall and thin and statuesque, and Aunt Eva sort of looked more like me, a little bit more voluptuous and round, but still sharp, yes. There was something. I just connected to her more. And it wasn't that my other aunts and my uncle didn't love me, because I'm sure that they did, but Aunt Eva just invested in me differently. Truthfully, my Aunt Eva invested in everyone and made everyone feel special. My mother wasn't always equipped to mother my sister and I. She was a drug addict and an alcoholic, and there were times she just could not take care of us. My sister, being 8 years older, spent much more time with Aunt Eva. So much to the point that my Aunt Eva had 5 children, but the people in the neighborhood will always say she had 6 because Raina was her 6th child. The rest of my cousins never looked at Raina or I as cousins. They saw us as their sisters. So much so that when I went to my aunt's funeral, my cousin had put together a huge, beautiful collage of all of my aunt's children and grandchildren and her siblings, and my sister and I were the only cousins on that collage. We were Aunt Eva's children. There were times during my mother's addiction that she and I were homeless. We slept in shelters, we lived in abandoned buildings, we slept on trains and on other people's couches. And I used to wonder how my Aunt Eva would know where we were and open her door, but I assumed that my mother knew that she could go to Aunt Eva as well. She did not judge anyone. She did not care what you had done and who you had hurt and how you had done it, but she knew that with the love of Jesus, everyone deserved a chance, and so she would open her door and we would be there. When I